Good morning everyone and welcome to another edition of On The Whistle. Me again. We're going to have a chat through Sunderland 1, Preston North End 1. As ever, I'll have a little bit of a chat about my thoughts around the game and then a little bit of a discussion around all your questions and comments. Thanks so much for sending them in. I think you'd have to say a really frustrating night for Sunderland. I don't think at any point they've really got close to producing what we know they're capable of, and that's obviously a big frustration really. I think that the one thing I would say is that I think that obviously we'll get to some of the drama later on and all that happened. I think you have to give Preston some credit in terms of I thought it was a good away performance, and I thought their setup and the way they approached the game was a really sort of clever and sensible way to go and play against Sunderland. It's interesting that we've had some discussions, in recent weeks that, fans talking about and asking me about where that kind of, intensity, the pressing's gone in Sunderland's game. And to me, watching it, one of the things that I felt that had happened is that opposition teams had realised that it just makes no sense to try and play out from the back. And I thought it was interesting that on Saturday, Cardiff City started trying to play out from the back from their restarts. Sunderland's pressing really good, caught them out, scored a goal. And 20 minutes into the game, Cardiff just completely abandoned that and stopped playing out from the back, stopped inviting the press. And I thought what Preston did quite well yesterday is they got the blend between not giving Sunderland anything to press, so they were quite unapologetic, I thought, and being quite direct in possession, really happy to go quite long with the goalkeeper and the defenders into Emil Rees, who, his finishing was up and down throughout the game, but I thought his hold-up play was pretty good. He was a nuisance, getting players around him. The sensible way, to play against Sunderland, I think, at the Stadium Light. But what they also did is they didn't just sit off. They actually put a lot of pressure on Sunderland when they had the ball. I thought their man-for-man marking structure was really, really brave. And credit to them, and they almost got into an early lead through it. And I think the first 15-20 minutes was this strange almost standoff whereby I actually felt that Sunderland could score at any time, because there were a few occasions, weren't there, where it was one or two passes away from Meander or Isidore being basically clean through on goal. And when you play that 4-4-2 with Isidore and Meander, that's obviously the situation you're trying to create when you isolate the two strikers up against the defenders with plenty of space to run into. The flip side of that is that Preston knew if they nicked the ball back, they had a real opportunity to break and score, and obviously they nearly did that on a couple of occasions. The game probably got worse, I think, as the half developed. I think it felt like we were going to be in for a really kind of exciting end-to-end game. That's not quite how it materialised in the end, which was a little bit of a shame. Sunderland, I thought, were labouring a little bit, although of course they had a massive chance to take the lead when Isidore headed Trey Humes cross wide just before half-time. And that was, it's strange with Isidore, sometimes it feels like the harder the chance, the more chance he's got of scoring it, We've seen him score some absolutely amazing goals at times this season. Sometimes it seems to be the simpler chances where he almost has too much time to think about it and where he misses them. And then a really sloppy start of the second half from Sunderland, and they were fortunate really not to go behind for the way they started the second half. And the irony was, I thought Lebris's subs were the right ones in terms of the structure. I think we could all see Sunderland needed a bit more control in midfield. And as soon as Chris Rigg came on and Romain Mundle came on and Sunderland reverted to their familiar structure, I thought they looked loads better. The irony was they then gave away a sloppy goal. So that was a little bit of a strange passage of play. I think personally I would have probably left Meander on. I asked Lebris about this after the game. I know it was a bit of a talking point amongst fans about why he brought Meander off and put Isidore on. Basically, it's kind of about him managing the squad at this part of the season. Isidore's obviously had two substitute appearances in recent games, and Meander's had a lot more minutes recently, so I just think he felt that Isidore's extra energy would make the difference. I think with Meander's confidence and the fact he'd been a threat all the way through the game, I'd have maybe gone with Meander, but it's obviously, as always, these substitutions are easy to talk about in hindsight. But yeah, it was strange because I thought Sunderland were playing their best football when they conceded, but then of course they were then chasing the game, having taken off one of their strikers, and that meant that Preston could be a little bit more defensive, defend their box well, wait for the crosses into the box, head them clear. And we'd probably lost confidence that Sunderland were actually going to go and win the game, or draw the game even, until that bizarre sequence of events where the game was paused for 5 or 6 minutes, where Preston had 3 injuries, one after the other simultaneously. And actually it was the crowd being fired up really, that actually seemed to sort of lift the players, get some energy, change the game. And obviously when the game restarted, Preston had 10 men, and what an amazing goal from Romain Mundle to win the game. So yeah, not an off night for Sunderland. I didn't think it was a great performance. In the bigger picture, you're probably looking at it and saying that's maybe why ultimately they haven't quite been able to keep pace with the top two, because the level of performance just hasn't been consistent enough. So let's have a look at your questions. We'll have a little bit of a discussion about a few things. So the first one, which I guess is the obvious place to start, Ian says, so what did you make of the time wasted? Don't get me wrong, we were really poor and Preston put a good away performance in, but that might be one of the worst, most blatant time wasting I've ever seen. And then another question from Hippie says, I mentioned after the whole game, but teams should be, but EFL should be embarrassed. Teams can time waste, but the officials have to not reward them as they'll keep on doing it, which is what it feels like as a supporter. So yeah, this is obviously related to the incident just before Mundell scored, where Ryan Porteous went down with a head injury. He got back to his feet. Kane Kessler-Hayden then went down with an injury, and then when Kane Kessler-Hayden was substituted off, Brad Potts went down with an injury, and then after a long delay, he was eventually substituted off. So, at the time, so I think there's two aspects to this. The one thing I would say is that I haven't had time to sort of reflect on it and sleep on the incident a little bit. The one thing I would say is that it's difficult for the referee at the start of that situation. So he doesn't have the luxury of being able to weigh up whether he thinks the head injury is, time waste and whether it's genuine. I think we all understand referees can't take risks with head injuries. He has to stop the game. There's nothing he can do in that situation. He has to stop it. And he actually did the right thing in that when Ryan Porteous gets almost immediately back to his feet, he tells him to go off the pitch, I think for extra checks, but to do so off the pitch. And in theory, therefore, the game should restart quite quickly, Preston with 10 men as is right, and with Ryan Porteous being checked. So I thought that side of things was kind of the right thing to do. And then, it's really difficult for the referee when another player goes down. And then eventually he gets substituted off and another player goes down on the pitch and won't move. It's really hard for the referee to know what to do in that situation. I'm not sure what he can do differently. Obviously, the bit that is then really, really difficult to sort of justify is the fact that the officials then clearly lose all control of the situation at the place of the last injury. So the Preston North End manager, Paul Hettenbottom, said afterwards that the last delay or confusion seemed to be around the fact that he was being told that basically, so what happened is, if you think about it, obviously, as we know, you can make 5 substitutions, but only over 3 sets of stoppages. So this was Preston's last stoppage. So if the game had restarted without them bringing Brad Potts off, they wouldn't have been able to make another sub because they'd had their 3 stoppages. So the confusion essentially seemed to be around the fact that because they'd already made 2 subs, they were Paul Hackenbottom claimed that they were being told that they couldn't make another one, and his argument was we can make another one because the ball's not back in play, so it's still the same stoppage. And there seemed to be a bit of a to and fro and a delay about that. It should never have taken as long as it did to resolve that. And obviously the thing that you can't really justify is the fact that one player who'd initially been substituted hadn't even left the pitch. So if it wasn't for the intervention of the Sunderland coaching staff, the game would have restarted with Preston playing with 12 players, and that is really hard to sort of justify or explain how that can happen. So that was really, really, really poor. The other thing I would say is at least there was a proper amount of added time. So one of my main frustrations this season is we see relentless time wasting, and then the officials give 3 or 4 minutes. That is the thing that winds me up the most, because that is rewarding, as you've just said there. That is just rewarding what's happened. Last night, I don't think Preston were rewarded. That is the one thing I will say. So they had to restart the game with 10 men and they were punished for it because Sunderland scored a goal. And then at the end, there was 9 minutes of stoppage time, which I felt was a fair amount. And to be honest, Sunderland probably should have played a bit better and made more use of that time. I don't mind so much, I think, when the officials acknowledge the time waste and put out a proper amount of added time. I think that's at least is some sort of consolation. So I haven't thought about it a bit more. I have some sympathy with the referee in certain situations, but certainly the length of the final delay and the fact that the game was going to restart with 12 players was, really, really poor. It's not something that you should be seeing at this level of football. Labrie saying afterwards it's something he's never really seen in his coaching career, and that can't be happening at a championship level. It's just not good enough. So definitely share some of the frustrations. But I do also think in some ways it is not easy for referees at the moment with the way some things are happening. The next question is from Stu, who says, will we see a different Job now he's not on a tightrope? He's been played more advanced and not really got into games ever since RLB said they'd have to manage the situation. Even tonight when he should have been in next to Neil, he was our most advanced midfielder, leaving Neil exposed. Yes, this obviously relates to the fact that Joe played 3 games before last night on 9 yellows, so he was 1 yellow away from a 2-game suspension. The second yellow card amnesty of the season has now come into place, so last night was Sunderland's 37th game, so the suspension's reset, so Job's no longer at risk of suspension. And I agree with you, Stu. I think that we might see a more like what we're used to from Job in the coming weeks, because to me, it's been fairly obvious he's been a little bit tentative. We know what Job is at his best. He gets up and down, he goes box to box, he crashes into challenge, he wins duels, he's really, really aggressive. He does look to me like he's been a little bit tentative in his 50-50s and in his tackles, which is understandable. But it does feel like that's something that's been playing on his mind. I do think there's probably, as we'll get to in a bit, I think there's maybe a little bit of fatigue there as well. He's played a lot of football. Sometimes I think when he gets into attacking areas, he doesn't look as decisive as he did earlier in the season. And I wonder if that's a bit of a mental fatigue thing. But I definitely think you can see that he's been careful. He's managing the situation. He's not taking any risks. And that probably stops him playing at his absolute best. So I do agree with you, Stu. Obviously, time will tell. But I wonder if we'll see another lift in Job's performance now that he's got through that kind of... that little hurdle. So fingers crossed that's it's certainly a big positive from the night, and fingers crossed I can see him get back to his best. Dave Max says, really frustrating, but the best we've seen from Dennis Sutton in months. Do you agree? He looked much like the player we enjoyed early season. Yeah, I thought Sutton had a good game. I thought he looked fresh, and he got into some good areas. I think it was a good decision to rest him. I don't think he'd been playing at his best for a little while, and I think Leo Yelder deserved the chance to get into the team, to get some minutes. Obviously, that was sensible from Lebris as well, because we're one injury away from Yelder being in the team, so it's really important that if that happens, he's match fit and he's ready. But I do think Sirkin looked like he benefited from the break. I think that it'll be good for him to have Mundell and Watson back. I think he'll combine nicely with a genuine left winger. Obviously, they're both players who like to cut inside, and I think that frees up Sirkin to overlap a bit and sort of attack the byline, and we know that's when he plays his best football. So definitely some encouraging signs. The fact that, there's an international break coming as well, when he can get another period of rest, hopefully that'll help him sort of reach the end of the season and potentially a playoff campaign at his best level. So, Michael says, does this game prove why we don't use 4-4-2? Yes, we beat Sheffield United with it, but I've not been convinced with it. Preston and Plymouth games spring to mind. While we were still very poor for the standards we set, we had slightly more control when we shifted back to 4-3-3, in my opinion. And on that note, we also have a comment from David Boyle. He says, does that mark the end of 4-4-2 for the squad? Really missed the additional man in the middle and seemed to just enforce us to lump it aimlessly, hoping for Meander or Wilson to capitalise on a mistake rather than working an opportunity. Yeah, I largely agree. I think last night showed why, by and large, Lebris prefers 4-3-3. I think that sometimes it can be a bit frustrating when, Sunderland are playing against a low block and you think, come on, we can afford another striker on the pitch. It'll help us when teams are defending deep and sort of packing their box. But I think what you also see is when you lose that extra man in the middle, it's much harder to control possession, and that just gives the opposition a foothold in the game. It helps them play on the counter-attack, but what it also does is it means that they can keep the ball a lot better. And that makes it really hard for someone to build pressure and to build momentum and to push the team back and sort of generate that feeling that a goal's coming. So I do think last night was a great example. I thought, as I mentioned at the start, the irony was Sunderland actually conceded after they went to 4-3-3. But I thought they looked much, much better. So I do think that we saw why Lebris prefers 4-3-3 in the main. I think I agree with your point, Michael, in that I think the Sheffield United game was probably the best example of how 4-4-2 can work. But I'm not sure the reality's always really been like that when Sunderland have played it. As you mentioned, the Plymouth and Preston games, unconvincing. We did beat Portsmouth at home playing 4-4-2 when obviously Meander and Wilson combined really nicely. But actually, I don't think Sunderland played very well that day. Again, we beat Derby playing 4-4-2. But again, I thought the performance wasn't great. And we saw many of the similar problems we saw last night in that game. So I think we see why 4-3-3 is the best solution for this squad. I don't think 4-4-2 is a bad option. I still think within games, it's really, really, really effective. Especially when games are opening up later on, to have one of Isidore and Meander coming on fresh. I think it gives the other one a lift. I think it's really difficult for tiring defenders to deal with that. And I think when games naturally break open a little bit and are swinging from end to end, it's a real weapon for Sunderland. So I love the 4-4-2. I think it's a great option. I think it's really good that Sunderland have got this kind of extra tool in their box. I think it could be really effective. But personally, I much prefer using it as an impact thing rather than from the start on the evidence that I've seen so far. And on that note, I thought Rigg had an impact again coming off the bench. Really tidy. Brought Patrick Robertson into the game. I think it's so noticeable when Rigg comes over to join up with him, and how much more Roberts gets into the game, how much more of a threat he is. So I think that was something that I'm definitely taking as a positive. Rigg looked much more like back to his best. So there's something I think we can take away with that. And then Chris Bryan says, Job and Dan Neil look dead on their feet through no fault of their own. With Job probably going to play even more minutes with England, surely we need to find a way to properly rest them before the playoffs. They're close to being run into the ground, and that can't be recovered from. Similar theme here. Graham says, really feels like we're limping towards the end. Not ideal with momentum needed for playoffs. Too late to rest players, freshen it up? ? So yeah, I think that definitely. I think the Solis injury is a real blow for Sunderland. Obviously, hopefully, he'll be back fairly soon after the international break. But I do think it would be a real benefit to get Neil and Job a couple of games rested. Hopefully, that'll still be something. Hopefully by sort of mid-April, you'll have Enzo Lefebvre, you'll have Salis Abdul Samed, you'll also have Alan Brown. Should be pretty much at full match fitness then. In that scenario, we might be at a point where we basically know Sunderland are in the playoffs, so maybe you can rotate a little bit more, and then you'll still have 2 or 3 games to pick your inverted commas best side and really sort of build some momentum towards the season, towards the potential playoff campaign. I am concerned about that. I think Neil and Job clearly weren't at their best last night. I think fatigue is definitely an issue with both. Hopefully a combination of the international break for Neil and, as I say, a couple more sort of players in the midfield area getting back to fitness means they can have a little bit of a breather before the last 2 or 3 games, and then it really will be full steam ahead for the playoffs. So I do think that the international break will come at a good time for a lot of these Sunderland players. I think we will see, in future weeks, I think we'll see the benefits of Rick having a rest and Alan Brown getting some minutes. That slowly the picture is improving a little bit, and it just doesn't always feel like it right now. But I definitely agree that I think there's some fatigue concerns at the moment. So there we go. Thanks so much for all your questions. Really appreciate it. As ever, so grateful for all you watching these videos. I really enjoyed doing them. If you missed it yesterday because of the game and all the stuff that was going around that, I have done a video earlier on the channel which you can go back and watch, looking at the club's most recent financial results, and I talk through what that tells us about where the club's at the moment, off the pitch as well as on it. And I know this morning James Copley recorded a great raw podcast with Daniel Story from the iPaper, who was out watching the game last night, so that'll be well worth a listen. So as ever, check out what we're doing, and thanks so much for watching and getting involved.